the U.S. Democratic Party would embrace accelerationism. Without further ado, I will call upon the Prime Minister. Here.
Just confirming that I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Very good. Bernie Sanders was right. The Democratic Party has abandoned the working class, and so too has the working class abandoned the Democrat Party. There's never been a better time for radical economic change than now. The top 1% of American wealth holders hold more wealth than the bottom half of America. Productivity is at all-time highs, and yet wage growth has been at all-time lows. The Democrat Party should use this moment and seize the opportunity to be a genuinely strong economic populist alternative rather than pandering and being the lesser of two bad choices. I'm going to devote this speech to explaining why this is the best move for the Democrats in terms of electability and why that's the most important outcome and consideration for the Democrat Party. But to start off with, what do we mean by accelerationism? We will define this as exclusively, as predominantly economic populism, which is to say a couple of things. Firstly, restoring tax rates and tax codes to pre-Reagan eras. Secondly, breaking up tech oligopolies like Amazon and Google. And note that we have the fiat to select this policy agenda, but also this is the most likely alternative and way in which people have understood accelerationism in terms of the Democratic Party right now. See, for example, that all of the policy mandates I've just listed out have been called for by people within the Democratic Party like Bernie Sanders and AOC, which in the light of the dismal loss in the 2024 election has been strongly held as the likely economic alternative that is radical that the Democratic Party can pivot to. Secondly, what is the Democratic Party's interest in this debate? We would say that it's predominantly electability for the reason that it is prior to any other consideration. Ideological dividends don't matter if you don't get voted into office. Now, I want to be very clear. Who the Democratic Party is will be defined by the caucus, the rank and file, the everyday people who are registered Democrats for whom this message does resonate, which I'll structurally prove later, rather than the liberal elites, which have held the Democratic Party captive and have led it to dismal failure in the 2024 election. So, opening government, opposition bench might say, well, the elites might matter, even if they matter less in terms of numbers. They matter in terms of donor power and things like that. But we would say that that's always secondary to the goals of a political party. Firstly, we would say the Democratic Party as an entity has a revealed preference and an ideological duty to adhere to the democratic means of democratic wishes of its constituents. That's because it's an extension of their democratic voice. But secondly, because Democrats have historically always persisted with far less of an advantage among corporation and business interests. They've been the party of the working class. They have won elections despite huge disadvantages in donation money because they had the masses of people on our side. So if we get more people to vote, that is more important than any loss in terms of corporate backing and donors. So that is why electability per popularity within the people is the most predominant metric in this debate. Let's go into our main argument, explaining why this is useful for the Democrat Party. I want to quickly clarify what the current policy platform in the Democratic Party looks like. It looks like two things. The first is in terms of economic policies. They've largely adopted a neoliberal third way stance where they essentially embrace capitalism as a functional system with some minor imperfections that they're willing to intervene in some edge cases. That has been the policy platform implemented since Bill Clinton, who was a very radically right-wing economics politician for a Democrat because he instituted things like NAFTA and things like that. But the way in which the Democratic Party have maintained some degree of progressivism is social identity progressivism. See, for example, the kind of democratic destiny politics inspired by Obama, where the Democrats believe they could make up for their lack of progressivism in economic issues by just appealing to certain minorities in certain edge cases, like African-American voters and Latino voters, all of which has failed. Why has this strategy failed? As evidenced by the 2024 election, three mechanisms. First, we would just note that Harris, like historically for a Democrat candidate, lost substantial portions of voters among Latino and African Americans, which suggests that the kind of the policy platform of appealing to people and hoping they vote for you on the basis of their social identity has not in fact worked. Secondly, we would note that not only did Harris lose these kinds of voters who typically almost always voted for Democrat, they also lost voters within traditionally working class Democratic strongholds. See, for example, how Harris actually lost very working class portions of New York like the Bronx and Queens, and only won that state overall by single percentage points. And lastly, the fact that she lost the overall popular vote overall and lost every swing state battleground, especially working class, formerly manufacturing blue-collar states like Pennsylvania and Arizona, suggests to you that it is working class people that were the main reason as to why Harris lost and Trump won. Why was this the case? Opposition bench might provide a few alternative why they lost the election. The first one they might say is, well, it was the economy, inflation was at all-time highs. But that's exactly the problem, right? Because when inflation was at all-time highs, Harris said, no, actually, the economy is quite strong. She just boldly lied to the faces of these voters. It's the fact that they do not consider inflation to be a huge issue is evidence of the fact that they do not consider the material conditions of everyday working class people in their pockets, which is precisely the problem that we will be fixing with our policy. Secondly, they might say, well, the problem is the Democrats were like too left-wing. Like they over-indexed on things like trans right issues and abortions. Firstly, exit polls say the opposite. They said the main issue was Democrats' lack of trust in them as economic stewards. But the main one is just that these people voted for relatively progressive candidates like Obama in the past. These people aren't endemically racist or sexist. They just view those issues as less important than their economic agendas. And the fact that the Democrats did not really talk about it created a false binary in the minds of these voters. Before that, with that closing.
So I hate to play semantics, but this motion specifically says changes to create radical social transformation. Can you be the first to explain why economic transformation or economic populism will therefore create that kind of social change and social transformation that you talk about?
So you don't think that economic policy has immense social ramifications? Like inequality, of course, has enormous, it just destroys the fabric of American society, erodes people's faith in institutions, creates things like crime. All of that has huge social ramifications. The way you resolve social issues like structural racism is the fact that African Americans are disproportionately poorer than white counterparts. It is always and always has been an economic issue. So that is why this is fair. Now, explaining why this is potentially profoundly solves the policy. It significantly shifts the tone of the Democratic Party movement. They might say, well, this is socialism, which is hated in America. But the fact that Trump's economic policy is more leftwards than every other Republican candidate shows that the mood is good. These trends are felt by people. In wage growth, it's at all-time lows. Wealth inequality has never been larger. And crucially, all of these trends explode after an inevitable Trump 2024 presidency because he wants further tax cuts. He is, in fact, placating corporations even more, which is why these trends intensify and therefore are likely to make it very difficult. Crucially, the people that voted for Bernie Sanders or the people that voted for Trump. So not only do we take away voters from Trump's base, we add them to the Democrats. For those reasons, we are very, very proud to oppose.
Thank the Prime Minister, then the Leader of Opposition.
I'll just take 10 seconds. Am I both visible and audible?
Yes, you are.
Yeah, just a sec. I just want to start with a couple of shout outs and then I can start with the debate. Just shout out to DTU and all my batchmates and my seniors who are responsible for why I am here, but also just Himan for being the most special teammate ever. And starting in 3, 2, 1. I first want to clarify that whatever opening government's frame is as to what economic populism is going to be part of accelerationism is going to be the most unlikely thing that can happen in this debate. There are 3 reasons why common average workers are unlikely to be part of accelerationism when Democratic Party does it. First, OG agrees that liberal elites hegemonize the Democratic Party in status quo. That means as a party, if you want to create a policy, you need to get an agreement throughout the party. Otherwise, you create the possibility of fracturing or the perception of fracturing that some liberals agree with you and some liberals do not, which you do not want. So the most likely outcome of this is that the policy that you're probably going to enter into through things like accelerationism is going to be especially about minorities instead of common average white workers, because that is what most liberal elites agree with. And if they hegemonize the party, you need to agree with them too for it to be a party policy to begin with. But second, even if average white workers are considered under accelerationism at opening government, the radical transformation is something that now they have to defend. As to say that radical transformation is still going to do things like disrupt markets and disrupt businesses because this is radical in nature and it's something that need to defend anyways. And it's going to hurt things like big businesses and hurt things like capitalists, etc., who now support a lot of Republicans, and this is not going to be a bipartisan issue anymore. What they do not prove is what is the likelihood of this radical transformation culminating into something tangible, because the reason that Kamala Harris lost in status quo is just because she promised a lot and she never delivered. That is why she was already in power for 4 years as vice president. They promised that we will cancel all student debt or we will legalize abortion, which they did nothing of. So they just overpromise and underdeliver is what something that keeps happening at opening government, which is going to be our case largely. But third, read the context again. The way you can even get economics under accelerationism is by also focusing on minorities, because that is only something that can help social transformation. That means this is especially going to be about helping Black workers, doing things like affirmative action, doing things like helping Hispanic people go into more jobs, giving them subsidies, etc. Instead, in comparison to average white workers in general, our comparative is just to run on more moderate economic policies. You promise more jobs to just average middle class in general instead of targeting particular minorities or particular sections, and this is going to give you more better chances of winning. We'll prove to you why. The first thing I want to question opening government and both government benches in general is that they have the burden to prove the likelihood of this culminating into any policy ever. There are reasons why this can never culminate into a policy, and this is what voters already know about. First, US Senate often votes on these policies, and that is why policy becomes a bill to begin with. And for the bill to pass, you always need majorities in the Senate. But in status quo, Republican Party has majority in both the House and the Senate, and you're most likely to lose these voting bills if you never get this bill passed anyways. That is why for the first time, Biden was not able to pass bills relating to canceling student debt or legalizing abortion, because he always lost the majority in Senate and lost the majority in House. So there is no way that you ever able to culminate into a policy to begin with for any impacts to be seen by voters so they can vote you in the next election. But second, even if these are common goals and these are bipartisan issues to some extent at opening government, the issue is still going to be implementation of it. That probably Republicans are unlikely to go ahead and agree with the radical transformation you want to do as a Democratic Party, and are still going to oppose you and more likely want you to be moderate. So they still do not vote for you anyways. But third, I think Republican Party is also in power status quo. That means they have more control over things like media and pushing their own narrative. So most likely, if you promise such over-promising things, they are probably easily able to attach this narrative of that, oh, you are over-promising, or what you are doing is just unlikely, even if it's the most good. So people are still unlikely to vote for you because they already had problem with you to begin with. That means there is no likelihood analysis at opening government as to what happens of this promise and whether how do people perceive this promise. Instead of this, they just run their case in vacuum. What does then an average American look like, and what do they want, and why the comparative then is better? First, they want things like moderate economic policies because US has just come out of a recession, and because of things like COVID and its harms of trickling down still in US economy, jobs are very less, and American people really need jobs. That's why most of them were against immigration, because probably money was not being put in American jobs to begin with. But second, US has been funding wars a lot. They have been putting a lot of money in Ukraine, in Israel, Gaza, which is taking away money from these taxpayers to begin with. That means these people need to see tangible input for Americans first before any other minorities who they do not consider as Americans or who they consider as foreign, and therefore they prioritize that over any other policy that OG needs to talk about. But third, Biden's past term faced backlash for promising huge transformation, which they never delivered, which I already talked about, which again is something that attaches to the Democratic Party in whole, that they just promise and do not deliver. But fourth, radical transformation often hurts the rich, and this is important because these rich people are the ones who probably provide you funding for your campaigns, probably provide you funding to go on these TV shows, or probably provide you funding to even post posters or whatever, so you can spread your word to the people. At a point of time, you are going directly against them and telling them that we'll disrupt the market, or that you can only hire Black workers, or that we want to harm your economic productivity. This threatens them as to say that we no longer want to fund the Democratic Party, or even if we fund them less. But second, even if not these big businesses, you just threaten an average white man, and this threatening is more in status quo because of things like building up of manosphere, where probably actors like Joe Rogan or Elon Musk have been building up that, oh, an average white man is in threat, and you put this threat more real and make it more tangible when you engage in radical transformation. And at a point of time on scale, these are just more voters in number. You need to cater to them, which you do not at Gulf. Before I move to the comparative POICG.
Joe Biden had one of the most excellent moderate economic policies where he achieved the soft landing of low inflation and low unemployment. Why did he lose the popular vote by 5 million people?
That's true. Joe Biden did pass some policies, but the problem with this is that Republican Party has the control of rhetoric. If you listen to debates, Trump did not say that, oh, Joe Biden passed a policy. Trump said that he failed on the promises that he did of canceling student debt or legalizing abortion, etc. And that's the biggest issue people had with Kamala. That's the literal question people asked when Kamala was in debate, that you were already in power in 4 years. Why did you not do anything? So people do not care about what they did because the impact of those moderate policies was also less. They wanted to know that what they promised or big promises they made, whether they actualized into something material or not. And when they did not have anything to show, it probably makes already a perception that they overpromise and underdeliver, which is going to become more tangible on your side of the house. What is the comparative then on running moderate economic policies and giving concrete plans? I think the most likely comparative on our side is that you create concrete plans instead of talking about vague, that, oh, we'll completely transform the social landscape. You give concrete plans that this step, we will impose these tariffs or this percentage of tax, etc. Why this is going to be good? First, Republican Party has a weak point in this because oftentimes Trumpian politics, which is something Republican Party has been focusing on this. Is it possible to stop the timers? Can't speak.
Yeah, sure. I stopped you at 6:55, so you have like 20 seconds left.
Yeah, cool. I can restart now.
Yeah, you have 20 seconds left.
3, 2, 1. The Republican Party has failed on this historically when Trump has just said, I have concepts of plan and not really plans. And this is what the problem a lot of voters had with the Republican Party, that they really do not give plans. And in future also, the politicians who are going to come out of party are going to be ones who follow the Trumpian politics because he has hegemonized the party. So you can harm them on that. But second, these are going to be bipartisan issues. Implementation is unlikely to be highly contested because this is moderate in nature. So you are able to pass policies and give tangible results, which people can see, so they vote for you more. But third, that the next elections are in 2 years, not 4. You are going to vote for Senate and House in 2 years. You cannot promise radical transformation in that short amount of time, so you still do get votes at government.
Okay, thank the leader of UP, Deputy Prime Minister. Yeah.
Okay.
Hi, I'm really sorry. I'm just sorting out my papers once. Yeah. Before I get started, huge shout out to Rishabh. I've never felt this rusty in a really long time. The last time I teamed up was also with Rishabh, like 9 months ago, and we reached a final back then. We've reached a final now, so Rishabh has just been carrying me everywhere. So yeah, shout out to Rishabh and shout out to DTU as well. Okay. PY is in the chat. Please do not unmute yourself. To quote one of my idols in debate, OG says, fiat, no fiat. I do not know why the motion allows you fiat to just shift the motion completely from social policies to economic policies that somehow affect the social policy and lead to social outcomes that are never really explained at opening government whatsoever, because their assertion is that economics leads to social changes, but they don't walk you through at any point of time how they affect the social changes that opening government so claims. The first thing I'm going to talk about is why you are likely to seem incredibly hard left on their side of the house when you even if you promote or economic policies that lead to positive social changes, and even why that itself is incredibly harmful for the Democratic Party. There are 3 ways in which I'm going to talk about this. Firstly, this leads to the breakdown of big corporations, especially if OG concedes that you're going to talk about like removing billionaires altogether from America, I think that is horrible for the Democratic Party for three reasons. Firstly, often these billionaires are the ones that create a lot of jobs. Their companies are the ones that create the maximum number of jobs. So for you to suggest that these billionaires should be taxed to a point where they're like not a billionaire anymore whatsoever, it's incredibly unlikely that this will ever get any sort of support bipartisan or any sort of bipartisan support. And I would posit that this is an incredibly unpopular thing to do, because often these billionaires are the ones that produce a lot of jobs or like control the market and control the industry and the ways that it functions, like the boom and bust cycle and all that sort of stuff. So it's incredibly unlikely that this gets support. Secondly, I would note that often these billionaires are the icons of pride of a nation like America. So for you to go out of your way to tax Elon Musk, I don't think that this is going to be incredibly popular regardless, because often these are touted as national icons of America, as like icons of capitalism. So this is incredibly unpopular as it is. Thirdly, I would note that this is horrible for investor signaling. So I would just note that this is unlikely to ever be passed by any Senate whatsoever, because the way in which you possibly talk about investors being taxed or like big corporations being broken down leads to a lot of investors just pulling out of these companies altogether, which is why a lot of like senates are never likely to come on board with respect to the policies, the economic policies that OG talks about regardless. The second thing I'm going to talk about is with respect to how you seem like you prioritize the black minorities, because in instances where you specifically divert a lot of funding towards the black minority or the black neighborhoods of America, you're still likely to see in the same way as OG claims, as someone who is prioritizing like the radical left or the Hispanic, the Hispanic and whatnot. This is for three reasons. Firstly, I would just note that minorities are likely to vote anyways for the Democratic Party, because they don't really have an option in the Republicans regardless. So it's not like you can shift to the Republican Party, especially if OG concedes that Trump is likely to be incredibly anti-immigrant or anti-working class regardless. So it's likely that you get the votes of the working class and the minorities in the next election cycle regardless. It is not a debate about them then. The second thing to note here is that you desperately need bipartisan support as quickly as possible right now, because you're in a unique state of failure. You have just gone through the election that has just happened, and the next election is likely to take place 2 years later in the Senate. So you need to rebuild the party as quickly as possible, and that's why you need bipartisan support for as many things as possible. The third thing I would note is that the Republicans are going to be against like a lot of redistribution anyways, because historically speaking, their ideologies have been more towards the American citizen and the average American citizen, as opposed to wanting to cater to the minority or the immigrants that have come out of America. So it's unlikely that you ever get any sort of bipartisan support whatsoever. This would explain why this is incredibly unpopular for you to do on like on-site opening government, and why this will never be accepted by the average by the average American citizen. What does Rishabh explain to you? Firstly, we don't think that we need to tax the billionaires. We would rather push for moderate social policies, and that's likely to get a lot more funding and a lot more popularity in general. There is historical precedence for this, because Bernie Sanders was an incredibly radical political candidate, but they never received any sort of support from the Democratic Party itself, because there is a precedent of you not liking radical changes within the Democratic Party. But secondly, I would note that this would probably lead to party fracturing on their side of the house. This is for three reasons. One, there's like when you start pushing for radical changes, there is usually a drift within the parties as to what do you support more. Moderate policies are far easier to get on board, because you give there isn't a huge trade-off to be made. But with radical policies, it's a very clear left and right. It's a very clear black and white situation. So people have to stand on either one of the two sides. With moderate policies or with moderate like suggestions, you can probably get a lot more people on board. Secondly, I would note that it's incredibly important for you to distance yourself from the disasters of the past. Notice that radical social policies is what Kamala preached for the longest time, but this was disastrous for the longest time. We would note that it's incredibly important for you to ditch that image as quickly as possible, and for you to now start pushing moderate policies for you to get rid of that hyper radical, hyper left image that you have. And this is good, because the more you like sort of carry forward the image of the past, the more chances you have of failure, because in the past people have already associated you with failures. So if you continue to propose the same policies, you'll continue to keep failing on their side of the house. So it's important for you to ditch those sorts of policies. Thirdly, I would note that party survival is a lot more important to you as opposed to any of the policies or any of the speculative claims that OG has. Before that, closing up.
So the problem with all of this counterfactual is that moderates don't feel catered to when they listen and hear moderate economic policies, because the problem that they deal with has been graphically ignored by the same policies that the party has been pushing for. Like this
No,
is
but that's the thing, right? So, on one hand, you have radical policies where the moderates have no reason whatsoever to be on board. On the other hand, even if it's like 50% of the moderates getting on board, we're still fine with that because it's still comparatively a lot more than what OG or CG can promise. Why is that important to this debate? And why is party survival and party cohesion the most important thing in this debate? Firstly, I would note that party survival is only going to exist when you cater to the huge voter demand. Rishabh explains to you why there is a huge demand for you to now propose moderate policies, especially with respect to how COVID has panned out and how the recession has panned out, or what sort of wars America has been funding, which is why there's a huge demand for moderate economic policies. The second thing to note here is that there is incredible positive signaling on our side of the house when you specifically make policies that the voters wanted. The voters feel a lot more listened to, and hence they feel a lot more connected to the party because they feel that the amount of trust that they can have within the party with respect to the policies that are likely to be passed by the party is going to increase. The third thing I'd note is that this is the sole or the most important thing within this debate because no side can actually promise that you would have a guaranteed win in the next election, but you would at least want to be a stronger side comparatively to this election. So party survival in the long run and getting immediate support right now is the most important thing to you.
Okay, thank you, DL. Member of government.
Hi. Can I be seen and heard?
Yes.
Thank you so much.
I'm going to turn on the lights.
I'm good. Unless you want that one.
We'll just stay down.
Okay. Thank you, Sam. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. In Hillbilly Elegy, J.D. Vance writes about how Midwest Americans were seen as the hillbillies, the backwater of America, who were too stupid for the rich democratic elites to be able to pander to. I think that's precisely the problem, because when you have this moderate messaging of moderate economic policy, it is behind the veil of intricacy, of complexity, that the Democratic Party has failed to accurately convey their messages. So, for example, if we say we will lower tariffs to this amount, and then we will ensure jobs increase by this amount, and we will pursue this kind of policy and trade negotiation through NAFTA, these are things that are very complex and difficult for the average American to understand. And that's precisely the benefit that Trump has. He takes all of these complex social problems like immigration, poverty, etc., and offers very simple solutions. We will deport all the immigrants. We will raise tariffs significantly and give jobs back to America. All of these are convincing. All of these work, and all of these get you elected. This is the messaging that Joe Biden did not have, especially when I think Joe had some of the most effective moderate economic policy. He avoided a huge amount of inflation, at the same time curbed unemployment right after COVID-19. That is a huge challenge. He successfully did it. But after he did it, everyone still said inflation was too high when it was lower than the rest of the world. When he did it, everyone said unemployment was too high when it was lower than the rest of the world. This type of intricate and difficult messaging is what has lost the Democratic Party the election, is what has lost Kamala Harris, precisely her association with Joe Biden and his moderate policy, the election. I want to talk about 3 things in entry. Number 1, I think the first thing is opening government has a very good explanation of the problem, but very little explanation of why accelerationism in particular is effective. I.e., they say we must appeal to the working class individual, not necessarily why accelerationism is the way to do it. Because I think OO has some examples of if we bring jobs back to America that can appeal to the working class as well. Secondly, we need to think of the Democratic Party in relation to the Republican Party, not just on its own. And as a consequence of that, maybe Trump can also counter this. We need to talk about why this is uniquely effective for the Democratic Party to do. Thirdly, accelerationism is not just a pick and choose of policy and of people. It is uniquely about messaging. How do we tell people what we have done? Because I would argue Joe Biden is one of the most radical presidents in American history by raising the minimum wage, the huge stimulus that he has given to America, but he has sold this as moderate actions to be able to not offend big business and the people around him. So, more than policy and the people we choose, it is about how we sell ourselves to the average person. So, I want to talk about messaging. I have brought up already the significant effectivity of Donald Trump. The reason it has been so difficult for Democrats to counter this is because Donald Trump takes these large problems, picks a clear enemy, whether it be immigrants or even the incredibly wealthy, and has made it difficult for the Democratic Party to be able to do the same. I think what Bernie Sanders, and I completely agree with the prop from OG, has done is to do things like offer Medicare for all. That is so easy to understand. If we have Andrew Yang, universal basic income for all. It is so easy to understand. Or even socially, we're willing to take on the social issues. If we abolish ICE and ensure that every immigrant and immigrant person in America no longer has to worry about being found, despite the fact that they might have legal citizenship, because ICE is incredibly discriminatory, there is a huge amount of safety and prosperity offered to this group of individuals. That's the first thing. We need to co-opt that message of simple messaging. And I think the reason this is effective, that I don't, opening government doesn't explain, is that the Republican Party has much stronger ties to big business than the Democratic Party does. And the reason that's important is because they need to avoid stepping on the toes of big business. If we completely give this up, we are much more willing to paint the enemy. We are much more able to swamp Wall Street. We are much more able to take private wealth and give it back to everybody else. Secondly is, I do think the Democratic Party is seen as radical and status quo. And I know that's a contradiction to what I said earlier. But the reason that that can coexist is because they're seen as radical problem makers without being radical problem solvers. That is to say, Black Lives Matter and the feminist movement after Roe was overturned and Me Too has been like associated with a lot of the social problems that exist in status quo because they create trouble in society. They make it difficult for everybody else. I think what happens as a consequence is we see the Democratic Party, or at least Republicans do, as people who offer incredibly radical changes in terms of the problems and disturbances to society, but offer absolutely nothing on the table when it regards to change. I think if we are already seen as radical, the difference in messaging that is negative, as opening opposition explains, not very large. But in terms of when our minority groups have to be able to vote for us come election time, it is important to ensure that the solutions match their problems. We cannot tell them that police brutality is one of the largest problems in the world and then tell them we will also elect a cop into office in Kamala Harris. We need to offer radical solutions, like completely taking down police unions. We need to take down all these social structures that cause police brutality, and therefore minorities are more likely to vote for us as a consequence. Thirdly, I think if we're okay, the vibes economy, right? Joe Biden had some of the strongest economic policy, but because of vibes, because people didn't feel it, and because the Republican Party consistently pointed at its flaws rather than its strengths, it was very difficult for them to meaningfully win here. I think what's important here is to message and say we are solving huge problems, to overstate what has already been done, to overstate successes, because currently the moderate version of success that have been stated by Joe Biden did not work and were underwhelming. And precisely because the Republican Party then controls and takes over the messaging of how success is viewed and seen, it becomes more difficult for this to happen. Two impacts here. Firstly, we cannot assume people who already support the Democratic Party will vote for them regardless, as opening opposition says. Minority groups who have historically felt underrepresented and don't feel like the very moderate and simple solutions to the Democratic Party that don't work will not vote for the Democratic Party. They don't have to vote for the Republicans. They oftentimes just don't show up to elections, which is what happened for Kamala. But secondly, this is how we get the Midwest back. We tell them your problems have solutions. We're not here to just dilly-dally around and take nothing. I'll take the PY from OO.
So a moderate policy would be we want more jobs. A radical policy would be we have jobs for everyone. Why is one message a lot harder to understand than the other?
Because how are you going to get those jobs? Is it by lowering tariffs? Is it by increasing tariffs? Is it by creating a negotiation in NAFTA? All of these are very difficult because you can't just explain your end outcome. You need to explain your policy. For us, the policy is way simpler to understand. Lastly, is this even a feasible thing? I would actually argue that a post-Trump presidency is the easiest time to offer the most radical change because a reversion to what the world is like this year will seem so radical in 2028. I.e., while I don't agree, while I agree with OG, maybe he won't have a million tariffs. He'll probably significantly escalate tariffs, right? Because that's what he did in 2016. I think a world in which reversion to the norm is seen as incredibly radical. It's so easy for the Democratic Party to say, let's take out all the tariffs Trump put in place. And that's a million of them. It'll seem like a lot of work. It'll seem quite extreme. But it's one that is likely to be effective and lower prices and be a win for Americans. Secondly, all of the failures of Trump, we can point to be an extreme action that was taken. We should take the extreme action in reversion. I think this is an opportune time for this message because we are going to face the most extreme and accelerationist president who will not meaningfully succeed. We need to be able to take over and work through this and make sure we take the next presidency, House election, etc. I'm very proud to propose.
Okay, thank you, Member of Gov. Then Member of Opposition.
Okay, just give me a second. Am I visible and audible?
Yes, you are.
Yep. Okay, I'm going to start my before I start, a POI is preferred verbally pronounced she, her, and I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think everything that was discussed up before to this point are everything that are highly contingent on the possibility of those policies actually coming in and actually providing the impacts that they were promised to. And second of all, what is more important to understand is how the people who are already in vulnerable position nowadays, who are wronged so many times, are going to actually react to this, and actually are they going to opt back into these democratic parties when they were already wronged by them and they already left those parties for the reason that no type of solvency was provided to them and they didn't see any types of results, right? I think it's not about how policies are going to be easier to understand, because before this, already a lot of politicians tried to provide their own policies in which they provided and promised a bunch of things, and none of this came true due to a shaky policies or just circumstance or whatnot. I don't think this is what's important here in this debate. I think the main metric to understand is that how do you persuade those people to actually vote, to opt into, and what type of mechanisms you can provide to them to make them believe again, right? Nowadays, due to the Trump winning actually the elections, and there's a lot of people who put so much effort and so much hope into the Democratic Party and put into Kamala are simply tired now because they are simply tired, and thus they already left those democratic parties for the simple reason that they are fed with those unfulfilled promises. They switch to at least be able to reap some type of benefits that the other party can provide them for sure, and that's what's happening in the status quo. While it's true that campaigns exist for a reason to persuade people, when you fail them continuously, it is going to get to the point when they're just giving up, which is going to happen nowadays, right? What happened in, for example, 2016 is that there was a huge leftist wave of people just leaving because they don't care about socialist policies nowadays if they just keep losing. Thus, whatever you provide cannot stand without the fiat of this actually providing some type of results, which I don't think any of the sides are going to claim, right? Therefore, what happens nowadays is the Democratic people lost their overall popular vote, right? Once this happens, this is something that is very hard to revert. The point is that first up, because when people put already all the effort, resources, and hope into something and they lose, I think when they move out to the party that is already winning nowadays, it's going to be very hard to revert their vote back, and this is going to at least take some time, right? Now, if you are weighing into two parts about governments and opposition's case, in which what do you want to stand for? First of all, for example, certainty that some actions are going to happen, even if it's going to take a longer time, and thus those policies are going to be more gradual, or you're trying to opt into a solvency. The issue is solvency that the government team are trying to provide and ensure is that I don't think there is any fiat to provide that this policy results that those politicians are going to provide are going to be at the end of the day certain to happen, right? Therefore, I think what's more important here is that people are nowadays, because of this constant failing, people are going to look for instant changes nowadays in which they are going to be willing to accept, for example, new policies in which, for example, they are going to shift the market. For example, abortion laws being accepted, as in these are immediate changes that people can now have the insurance that this is actually the solvency. Something is changing. And I think considering that even best case scenario on government's case, these changes are going to happen under their policies, it is going to take some time because nowadays they don't have that much of a voter base that they used to have now that they had to do that they had before, right? Therefore, usually as a human person, you side with something that can at least provide you something in return for sure, and preferably quickly, right? Therefore, what do people actually look for in these policies, and how is it going to be important? I think at the end of the day, as a human being, we're going to seek for your own benefits and some type of changes. And thus, due to the nature of people being risk averse, if those things are not reached, you're not going to risk it anymore, right? Therefore, what I think is going to be important in this case is that to understand what type of mechanism exactly allows you to get those people back to the democratic policies, and why this accelerated policies are not going to work here. I think by its nature, it was already explained that accelerated policies are going to be something which is going to have much more rapid changes than in status quo. It's something that is going to be, at the end of the day, which is already discussed, be not favorable by people, for example, in a bigger power, or someone, for example, is going to strip away from richer people. That's exactly the reason why these policies are going to be harder to enact, and therefore there is going to be, at the end of the day, some type of resistance. For this exact reason, now that you're trying to push for some changes, there's going to be the main thing that is going to repel people away from this is that there is now an ideological distance between policies that are accelerationist, in which I think how these differences are being perceived. I already explained to you, when you're rooting for radical changes and shifts, you do not ensure any types of changes, right? For example, if you're ensuring for some type of new policies, there is going to be this ideological distance in which people who already reverted to right policies are going to be feeling more resistant to join that. Why is that going to be so, right? Now that you're going to it's going to be harder to push for, yeah.
Yeah. Simplicity of message is not as important as the targeting of messages. Most Trump voters couldn't really explain his agenda, but just felt like he spoke to them and their problems. Our agenda transcends political partisanship because we're appealing to people and their needs, which you've conceded is the most important factor.
Once again, when there is no certainty of this actually happening, people do not see this tangible effects actually happening and being provided to them because they were failed so many times. There is going to be more of an incentive for those people not to believe again. And why is it going to be important here? Now that I've talked about ideological distance and why it's going to be harder for people to actually believe in this, I think this is about the ideas of people exist on a spectrum, right? You are going to be willing to believe something, for example, under the right policies, or something under the under the left, right and left policies, because the policies accepted nowadays are going to be very, very different, right? Therefore, what I think is going to be more important here to understand, and why is it harder to push for those policies, even those that government are trying to talk about. For example, first of all, there is a timestamp of these things actually happening. It is very hard to claim that reaping those benefits is going to be happening in the short term under the government side. Therefore, just the mere fact of the possibility of reaping those benefits being delayed is going to deter people away from this, right? And second of all, again, the possibility of this happening is still very slim and it's not going to be fiated. Therefore, the only way to actually get people back into this is going to push for the more of a centrist right policies, which Democrats are doing nowadays. Why is it going to be important? Because at least under this, you can ensure that some type of shorter term benefits are going to accrue much faster, and in which you can ensure that people who are going to vote for you are actually going to be getting what they are going to vote for. Therefore, we believe that CO are going to be the only side that can ensure that what people are going to vote for is something what they are going to get at the end of the day, and that's only the reason how you can regain your Democratic Party proud to be CO.
Okay, I thank the member of OP and government whip.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Nice. I'll take the OSU chat. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I hope it's clear at this point how unnuanced every other team has been in the discussion of how political messaging works. That people do not make their own judgments from a list of policies that determine their own voting preferences. These are things that are fed to the people and therefore are things that we should consider with regards to how the Democratic Party can win the next election. The first thing I want to do in this speech is take out closing opposition's case. They say three things. One, they concede that wide sweeping changes are inherently good when they're more rapid, which conveniently feeds to our case insofar as we want people to opt into the Democratic Party regardless. MO clearly says this in their speech, which means that this is concession to all of the things that Mikko already explains to you. The second thing they say is that rapid changes are unpopular, ignoring all of the nuance Mikko gives you of what happens after a Trump presidency. How in the vast majority of instances, what happens is an entry point for the Democratic Party to position its own policies as a way to fix the problems that are created by high rates of tariffing in the vast majority of instances. But importantly, I'd invite you to look at the comparative, where much of the messaging that is attached to moderate policies that are inherently more complicated becomes washed away in the context and the discourse that surrounds public discussions, which means that people either don't understand your policies or think that they're too soft to do anything in the scope of the inflation reduction solution that they've been peddling all throughout. The last thing they say is that if there's no security for these end outcomes, then people will not come to vote. Let's look at the comparative. I'd point out that moderate policies, by their definition and by structure, are inherently more complex and therefore harder to message and therefore sensationalize in the vast majority of instances within the political arena. And the reason for this is exactly what they say, that they have to balance multiple different considerations and alternatives in an attempt to ensure that you have a policy that could potentially cater to all people, when in the vast majority of instances, the complication of the policy makes the end impact so difficult or so washed up that they become unpersuasive to the average person. Clearly, closing opposition is out at the end of this. Let's now deal with opening government, the team with no clear positive comparative. There are two problems we solve at closing government. One, I think OG, as Mikko points out, does a good enough problem illustration, but falls short in explaining how they solve the problem of voters. And there are two reasons why. One, their characterizations of massive redistribution still falls to the same problems Mikko illustrates on ineffective messaging that has lost the Democratic Party the election. They respond to this in a POI that states that oftentimes it's targeting that becomes more important than the simplicity of messaging. But there's a chicken and egg problem here, right? It doesn't matter whether or not you target the right people, whatever that may mean, if the messaging isn't understood, nor is too esoteric for them to be able to gain the actual ability, nor the sensationalization or the feeling that the Democratic Party is actually listening to their views, actually listening to them and looking for a solution to the same problems they outline, when in the vast majority of instances, they still fall flat. So if anything, it's an explanation on how the messaging becomes more simplistic, that we're able to unlock the benefits of a more targeted approach in ensuring that politics for the Democratic Party becomes more persuasive. I.e., it was never about the actual content of the policy, but rather how easy it is to sensationalize this policy and how proportional it is to the problems that the Democratic Party point to. And here's where I want to weigh this contribution in comparison to what you get from opening government. First, it positions itself as a means to rally back voters, which is prior to the entirety of opening have benefits, where opening government says that re-election is the most important thing, and opening opposition agrees and claims that moderate policies are likely the most important way by which you're able to do that. Insofar as we explain why this is sourced from an ability to message as the Democratic Party, which is simply impossible through the esoteric and complicated moderate policies that are likely to exist under their side, it means that accelerationism positions itself as the only method possible by which the Democratic Party is able to garner those votes and remain persuasive, insofar as it's hard to determine whether or not quantitative easing or all of the economic measures that Biden gave you are in themselves accessible and good for you as a minority. But it's much easier to understand that UBIs, giving money to each individual person, understanding that it's good to be able to give them money and therefore message it in that way, and the capacity to be able to do that is what makes it far better. But the second thing that I want to note is that the mechanism that exists at opening government, that you pivot to one policy, you introduce it, and then you leave people to decide, are still vulnerable to a lot of Republican overtaking, right? Because a lot of Trump's policies rely on the same end incomes and end impacts, which means that you can't just stop at saying that you introduce a policy that that is like the end impacts of Trump, and therefore you gain people. It's only from Mikko where you get the actual structural analysis as to how Democrats can utilize this messaging in ways that make it more persuasive. At the end of this, we solve the two problems and the problem-solution mismatch that exists coming from opening government and explain why we clearly position over them and why the material is more important, why they can't get any of their benefits absent Mikko's speech. The last thing I want to do is deal directly with opening opposition, the team living in their own definition of the motion. The case exists in two mechanistically lacking parts. One, that their counterfactual is moderate economic policies that are accessible to everyone. And two, that the problem in this counterfactual is that there are concrete plans that they're able to leverage on the other side, which directly responds, at least engages with our case. Let's deal with the first one, on their counterfactual on moderate economic policies. I want to note, they name increasing jobs as a counterfactual, even if the process of that end outcome is likely related to accelerationism in the first place, i.e., more protectionism, more tariffs in order to bolster your own domestic economies, which are similarly the same sorts of things that you would be doing on a closing government anyways. If this is true, this means that this is a concession that in order to get the end impacts and claim all of those things as the Democratic Party, you must accede to embracing some form of accelerationism in order to gain all of these benefits. Before I go on, opening up.
So we asked you in Mikko's speech that it's probably still radical on both sides for you to increase jobs and it's still popular. Your explanation there is that perhaps it's easier to explain one thing, but you don't do any job whatsoever at CG to explain why radical policies are easier to explain to the average individual.
Radical policies are easier to explain because one, it no longer has to tread on the lines of trying to appease every single individual voter since you hedge yourself on very specific outcome and no holds barred, which is what universal basic income and other alike policies do. What we explained from Mikko is that many of these policies are easier to rally around, and many of the policies you name on the comparative are still radical policies which accede to the same benefits and the same harms that you would have had under your side as well. Furthermore, many of the reasons opening opposition gives as to why this is bad, how economic liberalism is unlikely, still falls away from the literal characterization of the motion that you do actually have fiat as the Democratic Party to ensure that fracturing doesn't happen because you are acting in the interest of the party as a whole. And oftentimes they exist as one unified bloc in the first place. Now, the average American doesn't want what they want and make these judgments, but rather rely on a basis of messaging that is simply impossible to access under every other team. Because we are the most rooted in reality and the most rooted in the mechanism of how this actually works, closing government is winning this debate. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, government whip. Lastly, opposition whip.
Can I be heard?
Yeah.
When in finals, everyone just wants to grandstand and nobody really wants to debate the basics. Because when I thought about the debate, actually, I thought it was about accelerationism, the policies that can provide real transformational change. Things like housing first policies for homeless people, things like universal basic income. Because the debate is simply, the debate ended up becoming about Democrats, whether or not they should adopt a more economically populist policies, then the motion would have said it. But this motion clearly says accelerationism and whether the party should adopt this particular policy. And I think the failure of the entire Gov bench is its inability to defend what exactly accelerationism looks like and its inability to explain why exactly it will transform societies in the instance of adoption. I think the problem, therefore, is that they are unable to explain what radical impact they are going to get. So absent that, maybe they can prove that they can get slightly more people, but they don't defend the actual government burden of achieving the benefits. So therefore, as a result, CG does this sneaky thing of negative debating where they say things like, if it's NAFTA, we really cannot understand what NAFTA is. And therefore, as a result, people will be alienated as a consequence. But center-right policies are not just about NAFTA. Moderate policies are actually not about NAFTA. Moderate policies can be literally the talking points of what the Republican Party stands for, i.e. inflation, i.e. rising costs, i.e. being able to therefore curb immigration because people feel like their chances are being taken away from them for jobs, for opportunities, amongst other things. These are all very simple things to talk about that we don't think is just about NAFTA. So if their claim is that moderate policies is only NAFTA, then I can maybe think that this can be credited. But simply this doesn't work, and therefore closing government's policies or closing government's kind of extension simply doesn't understand what the realities of what the Democrat Party is missing is. Therefore, I want to talk about a few things. One, can the electorate understand this? The second one is, do we get support? And lastly, how do we therefore unite the Democratic Party as a whole? First, can the electorate understand this? And this deals with CG. The first claim that CG says is that, number one, Trump is capable of pulling the moderate because they are not too stupid to understand things that are not moderate, for example, or things that are moderate, for example. A couple of problems with this. One, this is an issue with political execution and the charisma of the candidates. This is not really about the policies being too difficult to understand. But two, it is hard for us to really be like Bernie and can understand and say policies like Bernie and say policies like Andrew Yang can be understood for the sole reason that they are not being voted into parliament, for example, and they're not being voted into the Congress, for example, because their policies are not very popular, even if they are easily understood. So in that extent, they actually confuse political execution and political strategy on policy to begin with. In a world where we take Tim Walz's policies, we can also get all the policies of execution of saying things like, oh, actually this guy is really easy to understand, for the same reason that when Tim Walz went up to be the vice presidential candidate, everyone resonated with the idea that he said that that Trump was weird, and therefore as a consequence, people were able to understand. The problem here is that we are putting the cart before the horse. It is not that Tim Walz was bad, it is Kamala was bad, and therefore as a consequence, the kinds of things that we can still resonate with is still the people on the center right and the people that we were trying to pander to, i.e. Tim Walz, and not Kamala Harris as a result of this Biden administration as a whole. So if we were to prove the problem is not moderate policy being bad or not moderate policy being too hard to understand, but the candidates being bad, closing government has absolutely no solvency with regards to what the debate actually looks like, and therefore as a consequence has no extension. Second, do we get support? And this deals with, I think, opening government and slightly opening opposition. The first thing to say is that we will go gung-ho on targeting and like trying to talk about trying to break up like what do you call it, tech oligopolies, right? There are a couple of responses here. One, this is bad because you alienate the same Silicon Valley people who back the Republicans for the same reason that they will punish if they vote Democrats, for example. So the feelings of this particular billionaires is that they really want to vote Democrats because their economic policies are sound, but they're increasingly conflicted for the reasons that they feel that they'll be punished through economic taxes of taxing the 1%, of taxing the 0.1%, as a consequence have flipped their positions towards the Republicans for the reason that they protect their interests, for instance. Second, in the instance where we are talking about things like the FTC appointment, for example, Sarah Khan, for example, all these hawkish approaches to trade, hawkish approaches to things have often alienated the kind of billionaires they want to get. And therefore, as a consequence, many instances of capital flight ends up going to the Republicans and ends up being funding them for the reason that we want to protect these individuals as the first place. The problem with all of this is that what they say is that the problem with all of this and the things that they said is that we will get votes won't actually work anymore for the extension speakers. And what was mentioned by the extension speaker. One, because you split up the billionaires and the resources that you get. But two, you end up with significantly less support for your electorate because they are not American first as a consequence of this. The upshot of this is that if we follow government to turn futilely to the left, you tell billionaires that the Democrats are stubborn and will not be pivoting towards friendly billionaire policies to help them get the policies back, and therefore you completely lose the resources and completely lose the support of the people. What CEO explains is the context of the leftists being aware and the leftists and the dirtbag left being important is something that's like important that we need to talk about. But before that, yes, Brendan.
Yep. If messaging is simple on either side, what matters is what's said. Trump is to prove that working class pandering works. Why not beat him at his own game?
Yeah, we are literally beating at their own game by talking about center-right policies. Tim Walz is center-right, and they tried to pander to center-right, except the person on the helm was Kamala Harris and not Tim Walz, and therefore, as a consequence, the communication channels got blocked as a consequence of this. So, therefore, as a result, what CEO explains is the context of the leftist wave and the dirtbag left is gone because the voices are loud, but they have often demonstrated they are all act and no tact. But if we keep insisting on hard left policies, then you'll keep losing the game that you need, or the people that you need to win back. People's reviewed references are pretty easy to understand. Inflation, immigration, center-right policies because we are trying to respond to the literal same thing that we lost on. Trump won all 7 swing states for the reasons of this particular important things that are on the top of the mind of the individuals who are voting for them. Things like being able to eat, things like being able to be protected from immigration, for instance, amongst other things. And therefore, the Democrats moving more left is actually far worse because they are dreaming of the possibilities of what's transformational, but they don't actually defend the outcomes of this transformation, or they don't actually explain why people will respond better comparatively between the two in the first place. And therefore, as a result, if we're talking about policies that aim to shift the consensus, we don't think they shift the consensus, and we don't think that they end up with the outcome that they want. The Gov bench suffers from unicorn fallacy, which is if we do X, we'll get a unicorn, but the unicorn doesn't exist, and we cannot convince people the unicorn exists. Proud to oppose.
Okay, thank you, Opposition Whip, and thank you all debaters for a wonderful round. Can the panelists join me at breakout room 1? Yes, breakout room 1. Thank you so much.